extra flavor. About 6 cents a 7-ounce serving.
Sit right there.
Gentle for teeth has the leading children's fluoride.
I know my family, and when they'd like a snack, they'd like a snack.
Live game shows, radio broadcasts, and TV programming as a whole are not a place you would expect to find some of the most disturbed people imaginable. However, sometimes, more than a few times actually, these monsters manage to disguise themselves, act like they're normal people, and appear in various forms on live TV, without anyone knowing or suspecting a thing in regards to the various crimes and horrible things they've done, only for it to be revealed years later. Today, we're going to discuss such cases as we describe surreal and disturbing scenarios when serial killers appear on TV. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is one of the most successful game shows of the modern day. Both the British and American versions have been going strong since the late 90s, and combined have over 1,000 episodes. As the name suggests, the show is a competition with contestants competing for $1 million prize by answering trivia questions. Usually about 10 to 15 questions, which increase your earnings the more you get right, or decrease it with the questions you get wrong, with each of the questions typically being multiple choice with 4 possible answers. The questions tend to get harder as you progress, and contestants are given more time to answer them, with there also being the lifeline system, in which the contestant can ask an expert, the host, skip the question, phone a friend, or even ask a member of the audience. And if you get all the questions right, you win $1 million. This format was a major success across the world, not only in America and the UK, but even spawned many other international versions, such as in Russia, India, Italy, Germany, the Philippines, Australia, and the Czech Republic, which used a modified version of the game similar to the German version. In 2004, for the 333rd and 334th episodes, a man named Victor Kalavoda, a 27-year-old police officer, appeared on the show, where he ended up winning 320,000 Czech koruna, or about $13,000, which, adjusting for inflation, is around $22,000 USD in today's money, making it up to question 11 before being eliminated. Besides that, there isn't anything too notable about his appearance on the show. He just appears like your average guy, a regular old contestant. However, of course, he was anything but. Kalavoda was born in Slany, Czech Republic, where he grew up and went to school, and was described as a loner and introverted, and by the time he graduated from school and started working as a police officer in Prague, his life had taken a dark turn, as he attempted suicide on multiple occasions. Prior to his appearance on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, he had even planned multiple murders, and also almost went through with them, taking and concealing a pistol with him to the Prague metro, where he planned to kill as many people as he could, but could never find it in him to actually carry out his evil plans. About a year after his time on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, over the course of 3 days from October 13th to October 16th, 2005, Kalavoda would arrive at a forest near the market town of Nedvedice, and armed with a Glock handgun would carry out a spree of murders, first killing an elderly couple, and then, 3 days later, happening upon a man walking his dog, who he would brutally gun down, but ended up sparing the dog. Kalavoda had been seen during his murder spree and was identified by eyewitnesses, and was subsequently arrested on October 20th, 2004. In 2006, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for his horrific and senseless crimes, and was given the nickname the Forest Killer. It appeared that Kalavoda had been inspired by another mass murderer named Olga Hepnarova, who killed 8 people in 1973. In September of 2010, Kalavoda ended up taking his own life in his prison cell by slitting his wrists. It's hard to believe a guy like this, your average everyman, a police officer no less, could have such dark thoughts and desires, even before he appeared on TV, and acting on them not long after.
Number 1, what is your name, please?
My name is Ed Edwards.
Number 2.
My name is Ed Edwards.
Number 3.
My name is Ed Edwards.
One of the earliest American TV game shows was To Tell the Truth, created back in 1956, and ran through various different networks and hosts until 2002, before being reintroduced in 2016 and ending its second run in 2022. The game consists of 4 panelists, typically celebrities, that are presented with the strange and unusual backstories of 3 individuals known as the Team of Challengers. The goal is for the panelists to ask questions to the contestants, 2 of which are lying, and 1 of which has to tell the truth. This person is the central character, with the goal being to identify this central character, parsing through the lies and finding the real one. Needless to say, the series was incredibly successful, especially in popularizing the format, as it received many international versions, inspired other game shows with similar formats, and was syndicated for over half a century. Different from most of the other cases, in October of 1972, when Edward Wayne Edwards appeared on To Tell the Truth, he was already a convicted felon. In fact, that's why he was chosen to be on the show, as the panelists were meant to guess which of them was a convicted criminal. For many, I'm sure it was hard to tell that this man, prior to his appearance on the show, was placed on the FBI's most wanted list back in 1961. He had been a career criminal. Born in Akron, Ohio in 1933, he described his childhood as a rough one, growing up as an orphan, being physically and emotionally abused, and getting into trouble early on in life, ending up in juvenile detention and only being allowed free if he joined the US Marines. During his time with the Marines, he was dishonorably discharged after going AWOL, after which he became a vagrant, working odd jobs and committing armed robberies across the US, and even escaping jail in Akron, Ohio in 1955, to go on a series of gas station robberies, of which he did without wearing a disguise because he wanted to be known for his crimes, which of course he was, after another jail escape in Portland, Oregon in 1960, leading him to the FBI's radar, and his subsequent arrest again in 1962, being held at the Federal Correctional Institution, Leavenworth in Kansas for 5 years, before being paroled in 1967, thanks to good behavior, and his claims of rehabilitation thanks to the influence of a guard at the prison. After this, he became a motivational speaker and an author, writing about his crimes in an autobiography called The Metamorphosis of a Criminal, the true life story of Ed Edwards. It was during this time in his allegedly reformed state that he appeared on not just To Tell the Truth, but also another similar game show called What's My Line, both in 1972. Basically the same premise, involving a group of panelists questioning contestants to find out their occupation. Ed Edwards, under the guise of being reformed, was seemingly well liked on the show and in his community, at least according to his daughter April, as they had no clue of the true monster they were dealing with, whose crimes would go well beyond the bounds of just armed robbery.
We have arrived at the following conclusion. A pair of 2s on each end. The votes are all in. Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
Edwards is suspected of killing anywhere from 9 to 15 or even more victims, although he would only be convicted of 5 murders throughout his life, the first of which occurred approximately 5 years after his TV appearances and alleged rehabilitation. Edwards would end up killing a young couple from Norton, Ohio, Judith Straub and William Lavico, in August 1977, murdered brutally at point-blank range with a 20-gauge shotgun. Their murders wouldn't be solved until Edwards' arrest in 2010. He committed another double homicide in 1980 in Concord, Wisconsin, in which he murdered another young couple, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, who were stabbed and strangled. Early on in the investigation, Ed Edwards became a person of interest in the case. However, there was nothing to tie him to the murder, until eventually in 2010, DNA evidence was gathered and was used to convict him in these murders, as well as the ones that took place in 1977. While incarcerated, Edwards also admitted to the 1996 murder of his own foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, who he murdered in the woods and buried in a shallow grave, and employed to cash out $250,000 on his life insurance policy. He was sentenced to life in prison for his first 4 murders, but given the death penalty for the 5th known killing, although he died a few months before he was scheduled to be executed on April 7, 2011, at the age of 77. However, as with many serial killers, the true extent of his crimes isn't fully known, as he has been associated with other cases, such as the 1960 double murder in Portland, Oregon, of the couple Beverly Allen and Larry Payton, although 2 other men were tried and convicted in that case. His own daughter, April, suggested that there were at least 5 other unsolved murders, and likely more that her father was responsible for. Some people even believe that Edwards could have been behind the infamous Zodiac killings in the Bay Area of California during the late 60s, at which point he would have been 35 to 36 years old. Going back to view his reformed criminal persona on those game shows is even more chilling, knowing the full history of this depraved killer, a man described by his neighbors upon his arrest as pleasant and neighborly. It was only with the help of his own daughter, who suspected him of being involved with the so-called sweetheart murders, that Edwards was finally exposed for who he truly was. Bullseye is a British TV program and game show hosted by English stand-up comedian Jim Bowen from its original run for the network ITV starting in September 1981 until its final episode on July 8, 1995, having a total of 351 episodes over the course of its run. The premise behind the show consists of 3 teams of contestants put into groups of 2, one of them being the darts player and the other being what's known as the quizzer, competing in both dart games and quizzes against the other contestants to win prizes and cash. The show was quite popular in the 80s and 90s, even at one point attracting over 200 million total viewers at its peak. On May 28, 1989, a typical episode of the game show was being filmed. One of the contestants that appeared in this episode was a man named John Cooper. He seemed like an average guy by all accounts, nothing out of the ordinary. Only one thing in hindsight stood out: his self-proclaimed unusual hobby.
You've got an unusual hobby, John, haven't you?
Oh yes, the scuba diving.
The scuba diving. And apparently it's the place to do it down there, isn't it?
Oh, we've got the coastline.
Because is it the mountains are sort of inverted and you've got all these...
Well, we've got the deep water where you can sort of swim over mountains and all sorts of things.
We hope you all have a good night with us. Give them a round of applause.
But as we'll learn soon, he has a much more unusual hobby than just this. Other than that, it's reported that nothing else notable can be found in the episode, although it's hard to tell because the episode has since become lost media, and only has partial clips which have been circulated. John Cooper and his partner were eliminated from the game very early on in the first round, and so didn't leave much of an impact on viewers. With that being the case, it's almost certain that at the time of airing, no one would have suspected that this unassuming man would be a ruthless serial killer, who many years prior to the events of the show had already taken multiple lives. Back in 1978, John Cooper had participated in other competitions for monetary gain prior to his appearance on Bullseye, winning a Spot the Ball competition in a newspaper, typically associated with football in the UK as a promotion for the sport, in which people are made to guess the position of where a ball was removed from a photograph. Winning this game earned Cooper a €4,000 car, as well as a cash prize of €90,000, equivalent to about €500,000 today, or over $500,000. However, such is the case with most lottery and cash game winners, Cooper ended up burning through most of the money gambling and drinking, which may have been the motive behind his brutal robberies. On December 22, 1985, he found a large 3-story farmhouse located in Scoveston Park, Wales, in which he believed 54-year-old Helen Thomas was living alone. However, in the middle of his robbery, Helen's brother, 58-year-old Richard Thomas, returned home, which prompted Cooper to shoot and kill both siblings before dousing the house in gasoline and burning it down. Meaning, during this appearance on Bullseye, just a few years prior, John Cooper had already been responsible for the deaths of at least 2 people, but even more disturbingly, Only a month after his appearance on the show, on June 29, 1989, Cooper would be involved in another double murder. Along a coastal path in Pembrokeshire, Wales, Cooper encountered a couple by the names of Gwenda and Peter Dixon, who Cooper had tied up at gunpoint, stole their bank cards, and demanded the PIN numbers, before tragically ending both their lives with point-blank shots to the head. Throughout the 80s and 90s, over a decade, Cooper terrorized Wales, committing over 30 burglaries, armed robberies, and sexual assaults, with his spree likely ending in 1998, although the true extent of some of his crimes remains uncertain, as he is possibly linked to as many as 9 murders, including the death of 72-year-old Flo Evans in 1989, shortly after the murders of Gwenda and Peter Dixon, the unsolved double murders of Megan and Harry Tews in 1993, of which the murder weapon was determined to be a shotgun, similar to the one used in the Dixon case, as well as fitting Cooper's MO. And even a 1976 double homicide of elderly brother and sister, Griff and Patty Thomas, in which it was at first theorized that the brother Griff had killed his sister with a blunt object before setting himself on fire, which many had expressed doubts over, as a murder weapon was never recovered, and more so seemed like a botched robbery, which might have been the first of Cooper's robbery murders. As many have suggested, it's unlikely that his first murders were in 1985, as he would have been 40 years old at the time of the crime, and most serial killers start killing much earlier in their lives. Either way, he was finally arrested in September 2011, after a police sketch of the suspect was compared to his appearance on the Bullseye game show, which is why he is known as the Bullseye Killer, and makes it all the more disturbing when you look back and watch his seemingly innocuous appearance on the show, knowing the true monster and psychopath hiding behind his unremarkable exterior. This is probably the most famous case of an infamous serial killer appearing on an American TV broadcast, that being the dating game killer, Rodney Alcala, who made his debut on the show back in 1978 in the middle of his crime spree. The Dating Game is another very early American game show, first airing in December 1965 and being released on various networks over the years from the 60s all the way until 1999. The program consisted of a bachelorette who would ask questions to 3 hidden bachelors to find out which man she would want to go out on a date with, which would be paid for by the show. Over the many decades the show was airing, there have been many appearances of celebrities and people who would go on to be famous, such as Lindsay Wagner, Leif Garrett, Steve Martin, Phil Hartman, and Burt Reynolds. On September 13th, 1978, an episode of The Dating Game aired featuring the bachelorette Cheryl Bradshaw and 3 bachelors, one of whom was Rodney Alcala.
He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations.
Again, from the broadcast, he may seem like the average guy. He even won the episode. However, the bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, noticed that the man was off. She described him as creepy, as did another of the bachelors that was there that day, and so fortunately chose not to go on a date with Alcala. Prior to his appearance on the game show, he had already committed a confirmed 7 murders, with many more likely undiscovered. He was also convicted of against a child 2 separate times, even being registered as a sex offender in 1977, a year before his time on The Dating Game, which makes you really question the background checking that occurred before he was able to appear on the show, given his extensive criminal history, even if they had no clue he was a serial killer. Rodney was actually born Rodrigo Alcala to a Mexican-American family in 1943, moving to Los Angeles where he grew up, eventually joining the Army, where he was noted for being manipulative and abusive towards young women. One day in 1964, he had what was described as a mental breakdown and ended up deserting his post, hitchhiking from Fort Bragg in North Carolina all the way to his mother's house in California. He was subsequently evaluated by military psychiatrists, where he was diagnosed with a litany of mental disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, sexual sadism, psychopathy, and malignant narcissism. He was also determined to have a well above average IQ of an estimated score of 135. Because of these diagnoses, he was discharged from the army and would begin his chilling and extensive criminal history. In September 1968, Alcala brutally assaulted an 8-year-old girl after luring her into his apartment, where she was found in a pool of blood and unconscious. Miraculously, the child survived, but spent months recovering and was in a coma for 32 days. Now roaming New York City under the alias of John Berger, Alcala murdered and flight attendant Cornelia Crilly in her apartment in June 1971. During this time, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list and was eventually noticed and arrested before being extradited back to California for the attempted murder of the 8-year-old child, whose family had since moved to Mexico, which left the prosecutors unwilling to charge Alcala with the attempted murder, and leading him to only being sentenced to a measly 3 years in prison before being paroled in 1974. It was after all of this that he was again arrested in 1977 for the assault of a 13-year-old girl, and was still paroled after only serving 2 years. Not long after this, he would kill again in New York, that same year in July, murdering Ellen Jane Hover. It was also around this time he started to convince people that he was a photographer, eerily like he is introduced as in The Dating Game.
He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer.
He had taken thousands of photographs of children and even of some of his murdered victims. It was only after his initial appearance on The Dating Game that his main and infamous spree of crimes in California would begin. A time where there were multiple active and notorious serial killers operating at the same time in the same region, which confused law enforcement and investigators, occasionally attributing victims of Alcala to the Hillside Strangler, who would turn out to be a separate duo of killers. In November of 1977, he assaulted and killed 18-year-old Jill Terry Barcombe in Los Angeles. Originally thought to be a victim of the Hillside Strangler, she had been beaten and strangled by Alcala. Later that December, police discovered the body of 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wickstead, a nurse who was reported missing by coworkers after not showing up for her shift, and had been viciously murdered by Alcala in her apartment, which had been forcibly entered. On June 24, 1978, 31-year-old secretary Charlotte Lee Lamb was found strangled inside of the laundry room of her apartment complex, where she had been and posed post-mortem. In February of 1979, he picked up a 15-year-old hitchhiker named Monique Hoyt and drove her to his apartment, where he subjected her to unspeakable things, taking multiple pictures and even beating her head in with a rock. Luckily, however, she was able to escape and file a police report against Alcala. But somehow, this monster was able to evade justice and was released on bail. How this was even allowed to happen after everything he's done and all his known crimes up until this point is beyond anyone's comprehension. In 1 week, from June 13th to the 20th, he would assault and kill another woman he had met before multiple times at a club named Jill Marie Parenteau, and a 12-year-old girl named Robin Christine Samso, whose friends had seen her with Alcala and recognized him, and was able to help detectives create a sketch, which was subsequently identified by Alcala's parole officer, leading to his arrest in July of 1979, where he was finally held without bail, going on trial for the murder of Christine Samso. Eventually, Alcala was then connected to all of the previous murders, mostly through DNA evidence left at the scenes of the crimes. Alcala was originally sentenced to death. However, the sentence was never carried out, as he died of a heart attack in 2021 at the age of 77. He was convicted of 8 total murders. However, the number of possible or even suspected victims has been up to 130, as there are many unidentified women and children that were photographed by Alcala who could have been potential victims. 120 of the photographs were released to the public in hopes that they would shed some light on potential cold cases, although they weren't linked to any unsolved murders or missing persons cases until 2013. In 2011, he was linked to, but never charged with the murder due to lack of DNA or fingerprint evidence, of Pamela Jean Lamson, who disappeared on October 9, 1977, after going to meet with a photographer who agreed to take pictures of her. In 2016, he was also charged with the murder of Christine Ruth Thornton, who was last seen hitchhiking in June 1977, until her body was discovered in Wyoming along Interstate 30 back in 1982, although her identity was unknown until 2015, when her DNA was matched with her relatives. Alcala had in his possession an image of Thornton riding on a motorcycle, wearing a shirt recognized by her sister. Besides these cases, he was a person of interest in many unsolved homicides and disappearances, specifically in Washington state, including the cold cases of Cherry Ann Greenman, Antoinette Jean Whitaker, and Joyce Francine Gaunt. All I can really say is just about everything about this case is frustrating. The amount of times he was allowed to post bail or was paroled, even given the extent of his criminal history, is truly an unforgivable mistake that hopefully lawmakers, judges, and law enforcement have learned from since. As with monsters like Rodney Alcala, there is no rehabilitation, no guilt or remorse for their crimes. And thankfully, Cheryl Bradshaw could sense something was off about this man during his appearance on The Dating Game, possibly narrowly avoiding a gruesome fate herself.
Ed.
No, this isn't Ed.
Oh.
You haven't killed any prostitutes?
No, I never said my name was Ed.
Ever since 1975, The Howard Stern Show, one of the most influential and recognized American radio shows, has been airing, hosted by Howard Stern, a broadcaster and media personality that has since made waves in discussing political and cultural events in a black comedy and satirical manner. Though it's not without its critics, many listeners latched on to Stern's unfiltered and edgy style, which eventually led to a lot of controversial takes and content which the show was known for being embroiled in throughout the years. The show would consist of various celebrity interviews, comedy sketches, music showcases, conversation with guests, and callers from home. One of these call-in guests would give one of the most interesting interviews in the history of the show. Back in August 1997, a man calling himself Clay would call into the show and claim to be an active serial killer who had killed 12 women in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Okay, Clay, so what happened? How many prostitutes have you killed?
12.
Stern and his co-host, Robin Quivers, would question the man to find out details about him and his alleged crimes, trying to gauge how the man will respond, but also to see if what he's saying is at all credible. He admits to strangling one victim, but says he mostly uses a hammer as a murder weapon, claiming to have killed twice in a parking garage.
And then what, you strangled them?
Once.
How else did you kill him?
Well, a few times, actually most times with a hammer.
And where do you do this primarily?
I've done it twice in a parking garage.
His nonchalant, casual nature about what he's saying live on air as he admits to these murders is probably the most unsettling aspect of the whole thing.
Dude, you're a serial killer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
When Stern asks if he started off killing cats or something similar, he explains he started off with killing rats, as is typical behavior for serial killers, starting with helpless small animals before moving on to humans. He claims to have killed his first victim at the age of 16, and he even says he originally planned to have a signature with each kill, trying to attract attention from the police and prompt an investigation.
Yeah.
But let me ask you something, you were sending clues that you were going to do this?
No, I was doing that.
He was going to leave like a note for the newspapers and, you know.
But you decided not to.
He didn't want to be famous or draw attention to himself. But my problem is...
No, that's what I wanted to do, but...
Oh, but you did, but no one noticed the clues.
No, I never sent the clues. I never left anything. You know, I wanted to have my own little signature.
Right.
I wanted the thumb paint.
Oh, it's
with their thumbs.
Oh, really?
What do you want to do?
Thumb paint with their thumbs.
Thumb paint what, though?
I don't know.
Oh, anything. It was in a comic book a couple of years ago. Just seemed like a good idea.
Like you take the girl you killed, you dip her thumbs in paint, and then you do like a thumb painting?
Yes.
On a piece of paper?
Yeah.
At this point in the call, it seems Stern is a little more convinced that this might actually be genuine, and starts trying to extract relevant details from the caller, such as asking if he's white, which he says he is, and is an important detail, because the caller claims the only suspect in the murders was a black police officer. He also specifies that a lot of the victims were also black women.
You're a white guy?
Yeah, Howard, that's pretty funny because the only suspect they had when they started finding the bodies was a black police officer.
Oh.
Turns out one of them was associated with them.
He goes on to claim to have killed 2 people in one night. one in New Orleans and another in Mississippi, and when asked why he hasn't killed in months, almost a year, he responds chillingly.
So why do you think you stopped killing all of a sudden?
I really don't know, Howard. Part of it had to do with my car broke down.
Stern pries for more details, asking if he has any tattoos, to which he says he doesn't. But one of the last things he says in the interview is possibly the most disturbing.
Sometimes I ask them if they think it's dangerous, doing what they're doing, if they're worried about things, and they'll laugh it off, and that just pisses me off.
Right. And then you go ahead and you kill them.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there you go.
After this interview was aired, many people became interested in learning more about this Clay character and if he was actually a real serial killer. Many people doubted it, most thinking it was all a hoax made up by the caller, and some even thought it was a stunt by Howard and his team to drum up ratings and engagement, as he had been known to employ some controversial stunts in the past in order to get viewership. However, it seems after the interview, at least according to Howard, he was contacted by the FBI and asked to provide the full recording to them. For those who believed the story of Clay was authentic, they started looking into cold cases and unsolved murders of prostitutes in the New Orleans area, which led many to the case of the Storyville Slayer, a serial killer operating in New Orleans from 1991 to 1996, killing at least 12 victims, just like the caller claimed to have done. And that's not where the similarities end. Most of the victims were women of African American descent, as described by the caller, and in 1991, an anonymous woman was strangled after having a conversation with a man in Algiers, but was dropped off and survived, which aligns with a segment of the interview in which the man claims he let a few of the women live.
Do you ever look into their eyes and go, gee, these people were just children at one point and maybe they just had a tough life?
I've let a couple go.
You have? Like what happened? You're in the middle of killing them and then they what do they say? Why would you let one go and kill the other?
There was this one.
Go ahead.
I think she was probably really new to it.
Yeah.
There was just something about her. Maybe she reminded me of my ex-fiance, but...
Right. You somehow relate...
More of an innocent quality.
You somehow felt bad for her.
Yeah.
Most interesting, though, was that in 1995, 2 years before the interview, it was announced that police officer Victor Gant was the prime suspect in the case, and just as Clay had brought up, he was an African-American man that matched the sketch provided by the anonymous woman that had been kidnapped and almost killed. He also had accusations of abuse towards his roommate, Sharon Robinson, who was one of the victims in the case. He also had a notorious reputation for being a corrupt cop who ran criminal operations, such as racketeering. No conclusive DNA evidence or otherwise could be found that would tie him to the death of Robinson or any of the other victims. However, there was another suspect in the killings, a white man by the name of Russell Elwood, a homeless vagrant who was found suspiciously at one of the crime scenes, and even admitted to his cellmates that he was responsible for the murders while in jail. It's unlikely this man was the caller in question, though, as he was locked up when the call took place. He was still eventually found guilty of killing Cheryl Lewis, at least one of the known victims, and was sentenced to life without parole. He very well could be the Storyville Slayer, or he may unfortunately still be out there. And is the caller Clay that person? It's hard to say. Most of the information provided by the caller could have been gleaned from news sources and doesn't necessarily prove he was the true killer, and he doesn't seem to provide any information that can be corroborated that only the killer would know. He also claimed to use a hammer in these murders, but most if not all were drugged, beaten, and strangled. Either way, the call is still chilling to listen to, especially after you learn that without a doubt, the murders he discusses, whether he committed them or not, really did happen, and that killer may be still walking free.
Voici celles et ceux qui veulent votre place. Greg.
Nous accueillons Jocelyn de Mordel, éducateur spécialisé, Kim Bordeaux, auditeur comptable, François la Grande Motte, retraité policier.
This is possibly the most disturbing case on this list, not just because of the horrific crimes committed, but also because of the recency of his television appearance. It's one thing for a serial killer to slip through the cracks, revealing themselves to the public on game shows in the 80s, 90s, 70s, early 2000s even, but what about 2019? Everyone Wants to Take His or Her Place is a French game show first airing in July of 2006, with a game featuring 6 contestants that take turns answering various questions, typical of the trivia game format, before one of them is selected as the challenger who will take on the champion, a previous winner on the show, with the goal of them taking their place as the new champion. The longer you remain the champion without someone else taking your place, as the title suggests, you then accumulate more winnings and prize money. It seemed like a standard episode of the show. One of the contestants eliminated during the first round that many didn't bat an eye at was 57-year-old Francois Verove.
François, vous n'avez pas réagi. Greg vous a présenté François la Grande Motte. Direct, hein. Pas du tout réagi, vous êtes resté zen.
The host acknowledges that the man was once a policeman, to which Francois responds, yes, on foot, on motorbike, and horseback, smiling as he says it. Little did the host or anyone in the audience know that this man was behind a 35-year-old manhunt for a notorious serial killer who assaulted countless victims and killed anywhere from 3 to 9 or even more people from 1986 to 1994. All the while, he operated as a police officer of the National Police, as well as a member of the National Gendarmerie. At the time, the suspect was known as the Pockmarked Man, thanks to descriptions by victims and witnesses of a young man described as having distinct acne scars on his face. To many, he seemed to be a normal guy, described as a gentleman, although had a dark past and a quick temper. He had thoughts at a young age and told his psychiatrist that he was by his father. His first murder would occur on April 7th, 1986, when he would assault and attempt to murder an 8-year-old girl in the basement of her apartment building. However, she would luckily end up surviving the attempt. A month later, witnesses would identify a pockmarked man as a person of interest in the death of 11-year-old Cecile Bloch. A year later, in April of 1987, he killed Giles Politi and Irmgard Muller in an apartment in Paris, who had both been tortured and attacked with a knife. In October of that year, he assaulted a 14-year-old girl after claiming to be a police officer and handcuffing his victim, believing her alive after he raided her apartment. He struck again many years later in 1994, when he abducted and assaulted an 11-year-old girl at an abandoned farmhouse before fleeing the scene. It was clear to the police that the police officer thing wasn't just a cover. The sadistic killer was one of their own. Known for flashing his badge, using police equipment like handcuffs, and using jargon typically only used by cops. Still, the police had no way of knowing at the time who could have been responsible, as Francois was able to stay ahead of investigators thanks to his inside knowledge of the police. That was until the advancement of DNA technology, when finally, decades later in 2021, 2 years after his chilling appearance on the French game show, DNA samples of the active officers during the time of the crimes and in the same area were requested, and Francois was on that list. Receiving his official summons and knowing his time was up, and that it was only a matter of time before he was linked to the murders, he instead chose to take his own life, overdosing on barbiturates and alcohol, leaving behind a note which detailed his heinous crimes and how he committed what he called unforgivable acts because of certain impulses, but claimed to have not committed any crimes since 1997. Which implies that he indeed is responsible for many more disgusting cases which haven't been linked back to him just yet, as the latest victim was the anonymous girl in 1994, known only as Ingrid G. One of the most vicious and disturbed killers in France's history was not only a police officer and a family man, but even appears just as a typical older guy, laughing and cracking jokes on a Saturday night game show, answering trivia questions with no one any the wiser, and likely would have gotten away with his crimes had it not been for the diligence of an investigative judge taking over the case and the impressive leaps forensic technology has made in the last few decades. Watching back these clips, there is a certain eeriness which can't be replicated. It makes you wonder, with all the people you see on TV or even out there in the real world, at some point you must have seen a killer out there and you didn't even know it. Just like the people on these very broadcasts. That's the truly terrifying part. They don't look like monsters or evil and sadistic killers. They just look like regular people.